car rolls by, starts firing at him. Threw up in reverse. The 6-year-old boy was sitting inside the Suburban.
Welcome to Boyz N The Hood TV. Today we tapping into the streets of LA, and we're gonna be talking about the Avalon Gangster Crips versus the 8-7 Gangster Crips. Now, the Avalon Gangster Crips are a predominantly African-American street gang formed in the 70s by OG Jamel Barnes, who lived in the Avalon Garden Projects. Avalon is made up of 4 different sets: the 88th Street Avalon Garden Crips, which operate out of the Avalon Garden Projects, then the 5 Trey on 53rd Street, and 11 Sixes on 116th Street, and the 40s, which is on Main Street between Vernon and Martin Luther King. They've been known to beef with other Crips like the Menlo Crips, East Coast Crips, the 11 Deuce neighborhoods, but they also beef with blood sets like the Bloodstone Villains, Pueblo Bishops, and many others. Now, throughout the 80s and 90s, the Avalons will make their presence felt in pure violence against anybody who opposed to their hood. And in June of 1990, a 50-year-old woman by the name of Kathryn Giles was on her way to work when she was approached by Anthony Beck of the Avalon Garden Crips. Now, she knew Beck from the neighborhood because she stayed in the Avalon Projects. Beck would ask her to pick up a package from a nearby Exxon gas station. Initially, Kathryn refused, but Beck told her he would pay her money. So eventually she agreed. She went to the gas station, but once she got there, she would be arrested by LAPD. Now, the police stated that the money was for a ransom kidnapping that Beck was involved in. Not long after, Kathryn would lead the police back to Beck, and he would be arrested. Once it was officially announced that Kathryn was going to be a star witness, she began receiving death threats from the Avalons. Only 2 weeks later, while at the Arco gas station in Baldwin Hills, Kathryn would be shoved out of a vehicle and shot multiple times, killing her at the scene. She never got to testify against Anthony Beck, and due to lack of evidence, he was released from custody. Her case is still unsolved to this day, but authorities believe it was the Avalon Garden Crips who took her life. But as time went on, we would start to see a war begin to brew. In the early 2000s, we would see that war kick off between the Avalon Garden Crips and the 8-7 Gangster Crips. Now, the 8-7 Gangster Crips are located on the east side of South Los Angeles, between Main Street and Manchester, only 4 blocks away from the Avalons. And in August of 2004, the war would jump off, and there would be shootings, which included one which took the life of an Avalon Garden Crip 6-year-old son.
The 6-year-old D'Angelo Beck was shot in the head last night, and he is at this time on life support.
I have a son about the same age. It made everybody in the unit mad. It made everybody in the division mad.
Dad is actually known to us. Me and Tim worked that house for a little while. There's a lot of strange activity going on that kind of led us to believe that everything there wasn't completely legitimate.
A suspect car rolls by, starts firing at him. The people in Suburban throw up in reverse, take out this fence here, and back right up and hit the house. The 6-year-old boy was sitting inside the Suburban. He took one to the head. It went in his right side of his head and out the back.
It was a 6-year-old kid that was born into a situation that they couldn't control. The child died because his father was a gang member. The child died because his father was dealing dope out of that front yard and had gang members in his front yard. The complete blame for that child dying, other than the person who pulled the trigger, is on that dad's head.
Now, no one was arrested for this murder, but an Avalon Garden Crip was arrested initially after the shooting because he returned fire with an AK, and the police would arrest him at a nearby home. Now, in January 2004, the violence would begin to escalate even further when 8-7 Crip member Frank Harris' twin brother was shot and killed by members of Avalon. 2 months later, in retaliation, the 8-7s will kill a member of the Avalon Garden Crips. And this tit-for-tat shooting went on for months. And on November 11th, the Avalon Garden Crips will be at the Chinese Express restaurant, a well-known hangout spot that they kicked it at. Amongst them were Sherman Clark and a man named TB. While standing outside, suddenly Frank Harris of 8-7 pulled up and started shooting. Both Clark and TB ran, but TB would be hit in his foot as he ran inside the restaurant, and Clark was hit multiple times as he collapsed outside on the pavement. Frank Harris would drive off as Clark would die at the scene. Now, surveillance footage would capture the entire shooting on tape, and Harris, an 8-7 Gangster Crip, would be identified by an LA gang unit officer. He would also be identified by a man by the name of JP, who he was acquainted with. Eventually, Frank Harris will be arrested for this murder. And after multiple mistrials and hung juries, Harris will be convicted of the murder and premeditated murder and sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. Now, as the years went by, the war continued. And on January 16, 2012, an Avalon Garden Crip member by the name of Kirby, along with Londell McNeil, aka Tiny Fish, will be sitting in a car on 9800 South Main Street when a member of 8-7 Gangster Crip by the name of Keywan Harris stood in front of them and opened fire on the car. Kirby was critically wounded and McNeil was hit in his hand. When the EMTs arrived, they would transport both McNeil and Kirby to the hospital. McNeil will survive, but Kirby will be pronounced dead at the hospital. Kirby's family will hold a funeral service for him, and after that service, McNeil's cousin by the name of Quanah Pleasant was approached by Keywan Harris of 8-7 Gangster Crip, who asked her if she was on some Avon shit. She would go back and she would tell McNeil about this. He would tell her that he believed that Keywan was out to kill him, and ultimately he would vow to get some get back. But months later, the Avalons would suffer another loss. On August 18, 2012, members of 8-7 Gangster Crip, Cornelius Tyson, Warren Howard, Lamar Richardson, and Trayvon Wise stood outside the Avalon Garden Projects. Howard and Richardson ran inside the projects and spotted a known Avalon Crip by the name of D. Brown, aka DB, and the other group of Crips. Howard yelled out, "This Avalon killer, this tiny bone for 8-7, and opened fire. DB started running, and 8-7 began to chase him while shooting. DB would make it to his apartment complex, but he was hit multiple times as he ran inside the apartment building, and Howard followed him, continuing to shoot inside the apartment complex. DB's girlfriend would open the door, and DB would tell her, "They got me, as he collapsed to the ground, where he eventually died. Also injured, a 10-year-old boy who had hid behind a wall as Howard shot into the building. But ultimately, the 10-year-old would survive his wounds, and in the midst of that shooting, Richardson was accidentally shot by Howard in the leg. So after the shooting, Howard would help Richardson get into the car, and they would immediately drive him to a nearby hospital. Once police arrived at the crime scene, the detectives would get a phone call that someone arrived at the hospital using the name Frank Harris. Now, Frank Harris, as we know from 8-7 Gangster Crip, is serving a life sentence for murder. So this intrigued the police, and they immediately arrived to the hospital, and that's when they discovered Richardson. Police would then match Richardson's DNA to the trail of blood at the scene, and eventually Richardson and Howard both will be arrested for the murder. Surveillance footage at the apartment complex will capture the 8-7 Crips standing outside the project building. Now, it wouldn't be until May of 2013 that both will be formally charged with the murder, but about a year later, on May 2014, both Richardson and Howard will be convicted of this murder. Richardson will be sentenced to 50 years to life, and Howard will be sentenced to 75 years to life in prison. On October 25th, 2014, the Avalon Gangster Crips will finally be looking for some get back for Kirby's death that took place in 2012. Londale McNeil, aka Tiny Fish, along with Davon Combs, aka Buddha, Paul Allen, aka Set Trip, and Cedric Harris, aka Box, heard that Keywan Harris was over at the Roscoe's and Chickens in the 8-7 Crip neighborhood. They would get their guns and they would drive over to the Roscoe's Chicken and Waffles, but by the time they got there, Harris was nowhere in sight. So the group then decided to drive further into 8-7's hood until they saw Monte Carlo on 88th Place and Wall Street. Inside the car was 8-7 Gangster Crip, Dahlia Quinn, and Leroy Bernardez. Immediately, McNeil and Combs hopped out of the SUV and started blasting. McNeil stood right in front of Combs and let off one shot from a revolver, and Combs let off 15 shots, with one shot fatally striking McNeil in the back of the head as he collapsed in the middle of the street. Combs continued to fire the gun as the Monte Carlo drove off. Neither Leroy or Quinn were hit inside the Monte Carlo. As McNeil laid on the ground, Combs hopped back into the SUV and the Avalons fled the scene. By the time the EMTs arrived, McNeil would be found dead on the ground. Sometime later, McNeil's family would finally have his funeral, and Cedric Harris, aka Box, of the Avalon Gangster Crips, would approach McNeil's mother as she walked home and told her what happened. And months later, in January 2015, Davion Combs would also see McNeil's mother standing at a bus stop and decide to give her a ride. And as they were riding back home, Combs would tell McNeil's mother that Londale was killed by Leroy Bernardez of 8-7 Crips, and when the shooting happened, he was a block away when he heard the shots. But eventually, authorities would tie Davion Combs and Cedric Harris to the shooting after witnesses came forward, so both Combs and Harris will be arrested. And after the trial, Combs, Harris, and Allen all will be convicted of the murder. Combs was sentenced to 75 years to life in prison, Harris was sentenced to 65 years to life in prison, and Allen was sentenced to 55 years to life in prison for the murder and attempted murder. I want to thank everybody for tapping in, and I'll see y'all next time.